The Razer Kiyo X is the third entry to the Kiyo lineup. The first was the original Kiyo released in 2017. It can record at up to 1080p 30 frames per second or 720p 60 frames per second. It records at MJPEG. Unless you bring it all the way down to 480p, then it can do YUI2, and it's USB Type A 2.0. The field of view on the Kiyo is 82 degrees. It has a ring light built onto it, but it's not really that bright. It's not really that useful. I bought the original Kiyo for its launch price of $100. In early 2021, Razer released the Kiyo Pro. This records at up to 1080p 60 frames per second, and it can do it in the uncompressed YUI2 video format, unlike the compressed MJPEG. It's USB 3.0 Type A. Now you can still record in NV12 or MJPEG if you want. This has a variable field of view that you can select between 80 degrees, 90 degrees, and 103 degrees. Right now I'm using it at 80, and the reason is because it's the only one that doesn't cause a fisheye effect, and I have several videos on this displaying that. I bought the Kiyo Pro for its launch price of $200. Near the end of 2021, Razer released their more budget option, the Razer Kiyo X. Now the specs of this are similar to the original Kiyo. 1080p 30 frames per second, MJPEG 720p 60 frames per second if you want, and then it can do YUI2 if you drop it down to 480p. USB 2.0 Type A. The field of view is 82 degrees. The major spec difference between the Kiyo X and the original Kiyo is the Kiyo X doesn't come with a ring light on it. So before getting into the build and performance, the question is, why does the Kiyo X even exist? Since on paper it's just the Kiyo without the ring light. I think Razer released this more budget option to compete directly with the Logitech C920 and C922, two of the most popular webcams on the market. These share almost the same specs as the Kiyo and Kiyo X. They can do up to 1080p 30 frames per second, and the C922 specifically is more similar because it can also do 720p 60 frames per second, and these are both MJPEG. USB 2.0 Type A for both of these. Really, these are the same device. The only difference is this can do 720/60. These are slightly more narrow at 78 degree field of view, but unless I told you, you might not really be able to tell. Now I have a bunch of C920s and different variants of them. The cheapest I found the C920 was for $50. It's been hovering around like $70 around there at the time of making this video. And I got this like pretty inflated prices for like $135 or something like that, but it usually hovers around like $100. If you want to see current prices of all these webcams, then you can click the links below. The C920 is one of the most interesting devices on the market because this thing came out in, I believe, 2011. And in 2022, this is still the most popular webcam on the market. It's insane. Now, I'm just going to use the C922 for all the comparison videos because it's basically the same thing as this, except it can do 720/60, like I said. So let's get into the build quality and then the performance. The body of the Kiyo X is all plastic. It's very similar to the original Kiyo, just no ring light. It only tilts up and down. The wire placement is a bit suspect since to get maximum tilt, you have to put it through the gap inside, but if you do that, then you can't attach it to a monitor. It'll put pressure on the wire. For 99% of use cases, that won't matter. I don't know why you need to tilt it all the way up. Now, just like the other three devices, there's standard tripod threading on the bottom, and like the other three, the wire is 60 inches long. That's way too short in my opinion, and it was really annoying setting these up. There's no rotation on the Kiyo X, which is unfortunate since the Kiyo Pro has it, but the overall build is passable. Now for what really matters, performance. Now I'm going to be quite thorough here, so let's get started. I'll show a little bit of low light later, but that's not what webcams are good at. They're good when there's a lot more light. So I have my studio lights on. I've reviewed all the lights that I'm using right now: newer 18-inch advanced ring light, Elgato ring light, Elgato key light, and two Elgato key light airs to light up the back. I'm using manual settings on all four of these devices, and I set these in OBS. Now, for the Kiyo X, the Kiyo, and the Kiyo Pro, you can use Razer Synapse, but there's really no reason to do that because it just gives you access to the exact same settings that you can use in OBS, so you might as well just use OBS. So starting with sharpness, the Razer Kiyo X takes a big L here. The sharpest device is the Razer Kiyo, interestingly, the original one. And then we have the Kiyo Pro, next is the C922, and in last is the Razer Kiyo X. As you can see, the level of detail here is just not that great. There's a lot of pixelation, there's a lot of grain. You can see it on my face, you can see it on the shadows of the wall. You can see trying to look at my freckles and like the individual ones, they're just kind of like blending in a little bit. Lack of texture on my hoodie. There appears to be a lot of compression going on. The Razer Kiyo X looks like if you recorded a video with pretty much any video source, uploaded it to YouTube, and then downloaded it back, and then watched it back on your computer, and you're like, what happened? That's pretty much what the Razer Kiyo looks like out the box. One of the advantages of the Razer Kiyo Pro is it has very little grain. I do suspect that there is some post-processing going on, which is actually making it so soft, but yeah, there's not that much grain, and that's actually really refreshing compared to a lot of the other devices, even like the Logitech Braille, which is extremely grainy, and all of these other devices. The Kiyo Pro doesn't have very much of that noise at all. And as it should be, it's sharper than the Kiyo X, and it doesn't have all that pixelation and artifacting. The most disappointing thing about this entire review is that the Razer Kiyo, the original, is the sharpest by far of all of these devices. If you just look at my freckles, you can also see kind of the breaking down of the text that's on my shirt. Text in general is so much sharper on the Razer Kiyo, the original. Let me just go ahead and hold this up. This is the Razer Kiyo X, what text is going to look like on here. And this is, again, manual focus. It's all focused on me. This is the Razer Kiyo Pro. Text really just not that sharp on the Kiyo Pro. And then here is the original Kiyo. And the sharpness is ridiculous in comparison. It's not like amazing, but actually, I don't know, for a 1080p webcam, it's actually quite good. And then we have the Logitech C922. This is what the sharpness is going to look like on the C922. We'll get to this in a second. So yeah, just from a sharpness and clarity perspective, I would say that the Kiyo wins by far, and then the Kiyo X is last. The Logitech C922 is not as sharp as the Kiyo Pro or the original Kiyo, but it is just right under the Kiyo Pro, and it's, you know, pretty passable. It's nothing's really too blocky or too like pixelated. It's just whatever. It's standard. This is pretty much the standard for webcams, is the Logitech C920 and C922, for better or worse. Now, when dropped down to 720p 60 frames per second, the C922, Kiyo, and Kiyo X all look terrible. The grain gets cranked up like crazy, detail is lost. It's just bad. It's really just because these webcams are trying to compress the image to get the 60 frames per second through USB 2.0 without delay. Because if you put the Kiyo X at 720/30, for example, it doesn't look nearly as bad. Now, colors are where the Kiyo X actually has a pretty big advantage. Now, I have a lot of bright different colors in the shot, and then it's like with a white background. Well, my wall is like kind of a little bit yellow. I don't have the like hex value for the color, but it's like kind of like an off-white that's like a little bit more yellow. Anyway, I really like the colors on the Razer Kiyo X. I think they're doing a great job here. In order, I would say the best colors go to the Kiyo Pro with like an asterisk, and then the second best is the Kiyo X, and then the C922, and then the Kiyo. But I think both the C922 and the original Kiyo have some pretty major issues with colors. So starting with the Kiyo Pro, it does a pretty good job with my skin tone. It's the first device that really has gotten it like really even close to what it looks like. Now the Kiyo Pro does have one major weakness with colors, which some people have disagreed with me when they watch my reviews. The thing is, they never really seen me or my skin tone in real life, or my shirt, or any of the things that I'm holding up in real life. So it's kind of hard for them to really have any context to what it actually looks like. But me, having seen all this stuff, I can tell you for sure, the reds on the Kiyo Pro are off. So for example, the red on my shirt, this shirt looks like kind of bright fiery orange in the Kiyo Pro. It's not that orange. It's more of like the Kiyo X. It's just, just red, but it's not like, that hot. Same with the red that is in here. If you have a HyperX device, you might even know the HyperX Cloud 2, they don't have orange boxes. They have red boxes. So that's pretty much the only real major issue with the Kiyo Pro. Also, something I noticed with the Kiyo Pro, and I think this is kind of what is causing this, it's kind of selectively sensitive to light. So I'm kind of close to this light source here, and it's like you can see the overexposure is actually worse on the other devices. But what this does, instead of just like making everything blown out, it kind of just makes everything like a lot of a lighter hue than it normally would be. So like the Kiyo Pro, it's just like you have anything that's kind of like dark, if it's well lit, it will just look a brighter shade of whatever it's supposed to be. So this even affects my skin tone. So something that I think they really learned from this with the Kiyo X. Somehow my skin tone's even more natural in the Kiyo X. It's not quite as much of that orange. I think they did a really good job here. The red is a lot more realistic. Even like the Razer green, this is a little bit lighter than it appears in the Kiyo Pro. I think they did a quite good job with the Kiyo X's colors. The thing about the Kiyo Pro though, I say it loses out because of that issue with the brightness. But I think the dynamic range, and I'll get into that, really it kind of separates it. So if you look at my dreads, I might have to show a different shot here, but the ends of them are like a lot lighter than the rest. And that generally happens with just like sun bleaching. And you can't see as much because everything that's just kind of dark just looks, especially like if you look on the Razer Kiyo, the original, it's just much more dark. And you don't get that real separation of all the different vibrant colors in the shot and a lot of the other devices. But the Kiyo X is doing quite a good job with colors. The issue with the Razer Kiyo, the original, is it really makes everything either too blue. It has like a C issue. It's either too bluish, greenish, sea green, or it is too yellow, like too amber. And it's kind of hard to get it right in the middle. Like my lights right now are set to about 56-ish, 100 Kelvin. And you still get too much of the blue. And even my face is a little bit orange. There's just not really a great way to put it. For the original Kiyo. Now the Logitech C922, everything's always going to be too red. That's just how the C922 works. It's always been a weakness of Logitech webcams, and partially it's MJPEG, but I think their color science just wasn't on point when they made it. But this is a really, really old device, and I really like to see them actually update this. But yeah, so winner, Kiyo Pro with an asterisk, just because it has issues with the brightest lights. And then the Kiyo X, I think overall might actually be the best as far as colors, which is really interesting because it's the most budget option. Now, talking about exposure and dynamic range, I think the Kiyo Pro is on top because it really can show like the deep darks, the dark colors, but also some of the light colors without like getting like way too overexposed. That's something that I like about the Kiyo Pro. I think it does quite a good job at dynamic range. Also, of course, the smoothness, it's at 60 frames per second, unlike the others that are at 30. And we'll show some of the 720-60 in a little bit. But I really like that. You can kind of adjust the shutter speed. There's a lot more flexibility with the Kiyo Pro because the sensor, you can't see the exact size of the sensor, but I suspect that it's bigger. You can go down a lot more notches. And then when you increase the gain, it makes a lot bigger of a difference. It just performs better in more lighting scenarios than the others while retaining the smoothness, because a lot of times you have to make the other devices a lot more choppy or add more ghosting. So for example, if you just look at the smoothness, I feel like the Kiyo original is the least smooth. Now they're at 30 frames per second like the others, not the Kiyo Pro, but I feel like it's not quite as smooth. I'm not really sure exactly what that is. I feel like when there's a lot of motion, sometimes there's like some ghosting or it's choppy. But it could just be placebo, just like the C922 and the Kiyo X, they do 30 frames per second. So they're all the same frame rate. Either way, exposure dynamic range, decent job on the Kiyo X, the C922. Now the Razer Kiyo, also one of the issues it has is when you look in this shot, it gets overexposed pretty easily. There's like a sunspot that's on the wall. You can see that my dreads, like they're all just like way too dark because the contrast is really extreme. So the original Kiyo, not that great as far as exposure dynamic range, but the Kiyo X is decent. The C922 is decent. I think the Kiyo Pro is the best. Now, green screen performance is really a combination of sharpness, clarity, smoothness, and color accuracy all wrapped into one. So the Kiyo and C922 both did the best when it came to my green screen testing. Actually utilized my green screen a lot with all my different webcams, Tekken footage, Call of Duty footage, but the C922 and the Kiyo were able to do a really good job of giving me a clean outline from the background. Starting with 1080p, the Kiyo Pro does all right. It just can't really get a clean outline. It's passable, but a lot of green sticks around, and you really have to work with the smoothing in the green screen filter to really get it right, and it just can't really get quite perfect. The Kiyo X, I think, did the worst with the green screen. A lot of the artifacting and noise made getting a clean outline difficult, and the image isn't really that sharp to begin with. Now 720p 60 frames per second is something that makes sense to try with a green screen, because if you're playing 60 FPS or higher games, you can match the smoothness of your gameplay with your webcam. But that sounds like a better idea than it actually ends up looking. So I've already shown the 720p 60 of the C922, the original Kiyo with green screen in other videos, but the Kiyo X is really the same story as those. It just looks way too pixelated, even as just a face cam in the corner of the screen. I think the 720p 60 is useless on the Kiyo, the C922, and the Kiyo X. The compression is just way too much. I'd rather have the frame rate not be as smooth, because you're not going to be really moving that much, enough to really matter. but the lack of sharpness and clarity is really going to stand out a lot more when you drop it down and you get all that compression. Now, autofocus is really slow on the Kiyo X when it works. Now, this isn't really something I use, but just to keep in mind, it's finicky. At least it doesn't pulse like crazy like the Kiyo Pro, which will require you to get a firmware update, except the firmware update will break your Kiyo Pro, so you have to get a new one from Razer, which can take a couple weeks to get sent to you. Yeah, I think they learned their lesson on that. Anyway, I just use manual focus, and I highly suggest using manual focus if possible. Low light performance, as expected, is pretty bad. It's no different than basically every other webcam on the market. It's kind of cool. The original Kiyo has a ring light, but if it's dark enough to actually see that, then it's dark enough for that light to cause a blooming halo around the entire image. So the ring light is not something that I use. Now, this is the built-in microphone of the Razer Kiyo X. Of course, it's going to be bad because it is a webcam microphone, but you can use it in a pinch. This is the Razer Kiyo X. And for context, this microphone is the Razer 7 Elite, and I'm using it with a noise reduction filter on it, which is Refear. Okay, so for a quick summary, the Razer Kiyo X struggles when it comes to clarity and sharpness, but it does quite well when it comes to colors, especially for the price. Unfortunately, my verdict is I still cannot recommend the Razer Kiyo X. Now, the Razer Kiyo X does have better colors, but the sharpness is so much better. There's a lot less pixelation and grain and just like artifacting going on in the C920 and the C922. And that lets these perform a whole lot better with a green screen as well. So if you're on a budget, like I've said in so many other videos, I recommend the Logitech C920. I personally think the C922 is a complete waste of money because unless you can find it cheaper than the C920, the 720p60 is useless on the C922, and you're just kind of like burning money at that point. So I would just get this if you're on a budget. And if you want something that's better, then I would save all the way up to get the Logitech Brio. Or if you really don't like the colors on the Logitech Brio, then you can get the Razer Kiyo Pro, but it's just not going to be as sharp. The Razer Kiyo Pro, I have seen the prices dip depending on where you get it, so that might be a good alternative. I think the Kiyo Pro is the only real alternative to the Logitech Brio right now, but at budget, there's nothing that really can mess with the C920.